This is Jenny Kunkel, and in this video we are going to take our student course, teacher, and student courses and define them as entities within our logical model in Oracle Data Modeler. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's switch to Oracle Data Modeler. The very first thing that we want to do is we want to create a new entity, and if we mouse over, we should see that the new entity is going to be the second icon. We can go ahead and click on it and then click anywhere in our canvas, wherever we would like to place it. We can always move it at a later point in time. We can go ahead and enter the entity name. So this is going to be student. Once we have the name entered, we can switch to the attributes. And this is where we're going to set up each of those attributes that we have defined for our entity. So that's going to be our student ID, our student name, and the class level. If we use the plus sign and then come over to the name, this is where we're going to add student ID. We have defined a domain for our IDs, so we are going to use that as the source type to define our field. And because this is the primary key for this relation, we are going to specify the primary UID. An additional feature that we can do is to add comments that will be stored in the RDBMS, which define what the field is. And we're going to add at least one so that we can take a look at where it shows up in the DDL that gets generated. This is kind of a nice thing to do from the standpoint of if for some reason at a later point in time you've moved on and the database still exists and somebody has a question about a field, they can always look back to see if there's any database comments and maybe glean a little bit more understanding about a field that seems a little puzzling at the time. In order to apply that, we're just going to hit the apply. It should update within the grid. We can go ahead and add our second entity attribute, and this is going to be student name. We also have a domain defined for that, and that's name. And if we think about this, this is going to be a mandatory field, meaning that we want this to have a value. It's going to be required because without a student name, the student ID doesn't necessarily make sense. So we're going to go ahead and make that mandatory. Once we do that, we apply that. Should update in the table. Then we're going to add our last field, and this is going to be class level. For this, we also have a source type defined that has our check constraint that we've entered in our domain that we want to apply. We are also going to make this mandatory and go ahead and apply. Once we have all of our fields and we have no other requirements, we can go ahead and say OK. And that is going to finish up our entity. Now, if we look at our entity, notice that the student ID has a pound sign. That is our indication that that's going to be the primary key for that entity. We can also resize these with the sizing handles. And sometimes it gets a little picky and we'll just open up the dialog for you thinking that you need some other changes. We can always move it around the canvas to replace it if we don't like the location at a later time. And again, sometimes when you click off it, it opens up that dialog. Now we want to go ahead and add our second entity. So I'm going to click on the new entity icon, click on the canvas, and this is where we're going to add our course entity. Switch to the attributes once again, click on the plus sign. This is where we're going to define our course ID. This uses a domain of ID to define the field, and we are going to set this as the primary UID for this relation. Hit the apply, then go ahead and hit the plus sign, define our course name. This is also going to be using a domain to define the field type and size, etc. We're going to click on the name. This is going to be mandatory because it doesn't make sense to have the course name null when we have a course ID. So we're going to make that mandatory, say apply. This is all of the attributes that we have, so we're going to go ahead and say OK. And I'm going to click on this and resize it. And then once I click off, of course, it's going to go ahead and open the dialog. We want to go ahead and add the next entity, and this is going to be teacher. We want to switch to our attributes. We want to add the teacher ID. This has a domain associated. We're going to select the ID, make this primary UID. When we do that, notice it makes it mandatory. We're going to apply that, add the teacher name. This also has a source type for the name. We're going to make this mandatory because it makes sense that we have a value required when we have a teacher ID. So we're going to apply that. And our last field is going to be the teacher email. This also has a domain associated, and we're going to make this mandatory. We're going to apply this, but at this point we're not going to say OK because we're going to go to the unique identifiers. And it's showing us that we have a unique identifier here for our primary key, but we want to add a second one, and that is going to be for our teacher email because we don't want duplicate emails used for our teacher IDs. So we're going to hit the plus sign. Once we do that, we can go into edit mode. It's going to give us on the general the option to add whatever the name is. Don't get too worried about the name because in a lot of cases it's going to change it as it moves from the logical to relational using whatever the naming convention it wants. So I'm going to put in something like UX, and then this is going to be teacher email. Most likely it'll change as I indicated. Then we're going to go to the attributes and relations, and this is where I can select whatever attributes and relations are needed. In this case, we're going to move over the teacher email. We're going to say apply OK. And then now that we have that done with all of our attributes defined, we can say OK. The next thing that we want to do is, I'm going to go ahead and resize this just a little. Add another. So if I go ahead and click, this is going to add me another, and this is going to be for our student courses. Now, when we do our student courses, this is going to look a little bit different from the standpoint that we're not adding all of the fields that are part of that relation. We have the student ID, the course ID, and the teacher ID that essentially have relations, foreign key relations, and we need to set those up as foreign key relations. And therefore, when we go to the attributes, the only field that we are actually going to define is our grade. For our grade, if we look at our domain, we never set anything up for the name. And this is going to be something that we can switch to our logical. Then we can go ahead and from our source type, select what the type of the field is. And in this case, we're going to make it care. Then we can tell what size it is. And we're going to say 1. We're going to make it not mandatory. It's going to be an optional field because what happens if we're just adding the student course and it's not the end of the semester? The student doesn't have a grade at this point. So we're not making it mandatory. And we're going to go ahead and say apply and OK. And at this point, we just have this one entity, and I'm going to move it so it's kind of a little bit more centered here, and I'm going to minimize it just a little bit. But how do I get those values for the student ID, the course ID, and the teacher ID into this relation? And as I indicated, we have foreign key relationships because our student course will have a student ID, and we need it to reference back to the student relation. And in this case, we have a course ID that's going to be referred back to the course relation, and we're going to have a teacher ID that's going to refer back to the teacher relation. Now, in the case of our student and course, this is going to be the primary key. The teacher ID is not. So therefore, when we try to do our foreign key relation, we need to look at the options that are available. There are 2 different options, and we're going to use both of them. We are going to look starting at the very first one. It's showing us that that's a new M to N relation. So this is going to be used for many to many type relations. Then the next one over is going to be 1 to N relation, and that's going to be a one-to-many. And then if we go over one more, that's going to be a one-to-n relation identifying. So there are two foreign key relation types for one-to-many relations. And then we also have our one-to-one relation. We're going to be focusing in on the one-to-n and the one-to-n relation identifying. Now, when I want to have the foreign key as part of that primary key in this relation down here, I'm going to use not the one-to-n, but the one-to-n relation identifying. So that's going to indicate when it needs to generate stuff that it's going to be part of that primary key. So I'm going to click on this icon here and go from my student to my student courses. And it doesn't really matter what I call this. It's going to automatically generate stuff, so I'm just going to go ahead and say OK. Now we have the little chicken feet, so to speak, pointing to our student courses. If you have it backwards, you need to change it. We always go from the actual parent to the child when we're doing our foreign key relations. We're going to go ahead and use that same icon, so that's going to be the one-to-n relation identifying. We're going to click on that. We're going to click on our course, and then we're going to click on our student course. Say OK. And then we have one left, and that's going to use the other relation because that's not going to be part of the primary key. So in that case, we're going to use the one-to-n relation that does not have the identifying in that. So the one-to-n relation, click on that, click on the teacher, and go to the student courses and say OK. So at this point, we have our logical model totally defined, and we're ready to move on to our relational model, and we'll do that in the next video.